Well, welcome everybody to the latest Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies workshop. This one is on impact evaluation framework, a real nerds workshop, and I can see that we have a whole bunch of really good nerds with us today, Climate Assembly nerds, which is great. Just a bit of background before I hand over to my colleague who's going to be leading this. Just a bit of background of why we've developed an impact evaluation framework. Knoca has always been interested in ensuring that the assemblies have as much impact as possible. After all, why run an assembly if you don't realize impact? And what we realized is that most of the guidance, but also most of the existing evaluations that happened, tended to be on two aspects of the process. One was on the deliberative experience. What was it like for the citizens to participate? And the other was on questions of integrity of process design, and almost nothing on impact. And when you look at the OECD guidance, it's a minor part of their guidance. You look at existing valuations, they've not really touched on it. And there's a couple of reasons for that, I think. The first is there isn't much guidance out there on what to do. The second is that we're often limited in evaluation by our funders, who want to have evaluations done as soon as a project has finished. And one thing we know about impact evaluation is it takes time. So one of the things that we were trying to do was to try and provide the community of organizers, commissioners, and evaluators with some sort of framework. And we also wanted to be really clear that it wasn't just necessarily about policy impact. You know, the question of, did this recommendation get taken up? Did this recommendation affect policy? And we wanted to recognize that actually there are a wide range of impacts, and we need to be much broader and much nuanced in our understanding of impact. For example, I'll just give you a couple of examples. For example, in Ireland, while the Assembly did have significant impact on the climate in climate policy in Ireland, probably arguably its biggest impact was the joint committee that was created to deal with the Assembly's recommendations became a permanent climate committee within Parliament. So we actually had a piece of infrastructure created because of the Assembly. The second one we might think about is in France, where the convention had a massive impact on the public debate on climate. And both of those things would be missed if we only focused on the question of policy impact. So about a year or so ago, we invited our friends at CAST to help develop an impact evaluation framework based on a really excellent briefing they'd done for us to launch Knoca on impact and legacy. And in June 2022, we produced the first version of that. And that impact evaluation framework has been used in a couple of assemblies. A couple of them we'll be talking about today in Spain, to actually try and capture some of the variety of impacts of assemblies. But it was always our intention that this was just a first stab. This wasn't to say that we didn't think Christina and Stuart could do a great job. We knew they would do a great job, but we thought that we would produce this, we would test it in the field, we get other people to look at it, and we would give an opportunity to members of the Knoca community to engage and to think about how we could further develop that impact evaluation. And that is what we're doing today, is that first stage of revisiting the framework and thinking about how we could improve it. I'm just losing my voice. I'm sorry about this, which is good because I'm not leading the session. I forgot to say that the session will be recorded. We'll be recording the plenary session, and that will actually go on our website, as it always does. We'll also be recording the breakout groups, but that's just for our purposes, in order that we can collect the information, the ideas that people had. Anyway, I'm not responsible for this particular workshop. I'm handing over to my colleague Mark Beanland from the Danish Board of Technology, who's one of the members of the Knoca Knoca Management Committee. And Mark has been leading the work, trying to pull together the evaluation of the evaluation. So Mark, let me pass over to you, and look forward to the trip.
Wonderful. Thank you for starting us up, Graham. And it's a pleasure to see so many very wise people here. So without any ado, I'll be guiding you through today. We've got an interesting lineup where some, both you could say researchers and practitioners that have been working with the framework are going to share some of their insights. The first half of today will be a lot of one-way communication. You'll be given a lot of insight into what the framework is about, why it was created, some of the most interesting areas for discussion about how it could be improved. And then after a break, which will be at roughly 3:30, we'll jump into some breakout rooms. And that'll really be all about trying to get the best out of all of our wise practitioners in this network. So please don't hold back when that time comes. You're also welcome to push in any questions in the chat. We'll try to follow up the best we can. We'll try to make it a lively discussion so that you have lots of rich input to take with you. It's relevant for me to say, though, that this is a bit of a special workshop, as Graham already hinted to. We actually hope that this will form the basis of an improved impact evaluation framework. And in that sense, it will be most meaningful for those of you who've actually looked at the impact evaluation framework. So I hope many of you have read it. It'll also be particularly valuable for those who've either worked on designing an assembly or who's been working on evaluating an assembly. So of course, we know that it's about evaluating, but it's first and foremost about impact. And I think it's safe to say that any one of us who tries to work on assemblies, we obviously hope that there will be impact. So some of the interesting questions here will be what the distinction is between the intended impact and the unintended impact. And we'll be looking a little bit at the systems that we try to influence that are often very complex. We'll have both practitioners looking at it from a practitioner's perspective, and we'll have someone looking at it from what I might call a meta perspective as well. So hopefully it'll be very rich. I'm very much looking forward to it. And I'll be presenting the people who will take the floor kind of as we go along, because we have 6 people who will be sharing a bit of insight today. So to keep it fresh in your memories, I'm going to just take the ones who are about to step onto the stage. And the first ones are Stuart Capstick and Christina Demski. And I know Christina might not quite have arrived yet. She had a bit of an emergency. But Stuart and Christina are from CAST. And I have to look up the name of the Center for Climate Change and Social Transformation. So as you know, they've made this first, what we might call a version 1.0. And Stuart, would you take us away on sharing some of the perspectives on how it came to have the form that it does today? And as you speak, I will do my best to try to share your slides from my screen.
Thank you very much, Mark. Oops, unmute myself. Yes, I'll do my best. As Mark said, hello everyone, by the way. We found out just a few minutes before we started that Christina has been called away to a bit of an emergency. The way we had planned this session is that Christina was going to talk you through the first half of the presentation, and I was going to do the second half. So please be kind to me in that I have only had a few minutes to look at the first half of this presentation, but I'll do my best. And of course, I'm familiar with the work because I've worked with Christina on lots of things over the years. So hopefully she'll be able to join it. Well, she will be able to join us soon, but just not immediately. So first, to give a little bit of background. As Mark said, Christina and I are from the CAST Centre, which is short for the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. We're based in the UK. Most of our work is focused on the UK and on mitigation around climate change, but with respect to all different types of scales, from the individual to national policy level. And also taking into account things like co-benefits. So, for example, what are the associated positive consequences of climate action, or conversely, where might things not be well aligned with climate action? So Christina Demski is a reader at the University of Bath. Her background is in psychology and social science. My background is similar, but I'm based at Cardiff University, where I'm a senior research fellow. I think it's useful to say as well, and kind of reading through some of the well, both reading through some of the comments and reviews on the framework, but also thinking more broadly about how a lot of issues around climate deliberation are discussed. It's quite interesting. It's been quite interesting, I think, that some people are coming at this approach from the point of view of sort of climate and climate researchers, and a concern, as in my case, about the primacy of trying to take action on climate change. Other people's background and expertise, and I'm sure this would apply to many people here, is perhaps more from the deliberative democracy or participatory approach, and some of us are kind of in the middle of that space. But I would say that myself and Christina come at this more from a research into climate change perspective, but we also have a background in doing deliberative workshops with members of the public, and other sorts of exercises of that sort. So I'll say next slide, please. Let's try this one. Okay, so as Graham outlined, the aims of developing this framework were to try to think about what impact of climate deliberation might look like if you tried to evaluate it. As I say, I've come at this problem from the point of view of climate change, and so often I feel quite impatient, like, does this actually further climate action? And so this was important to myself and Christina, and I think the Knoca network as well, to try to think about how we guide evaluation, it says here, but really we're looking at the evaluation of impact of past and future climate assemblies. Now, we were asked specifically by Graham and his team to kind of think as broadly as we could about what that impact might mean. So we tried to open up to think more broadly about what counts as impact, because as Graham said a few minutes ago, why would we run these types of processes if they don't have an impact on climate action? Now, that might be making climate action more ambitious. It might be taking, as in the UK Climate Assembly, a sort of pre-configured emissions reduction target and saying, how do you do that? What is the impact on policy to achieve a pre-stated aim? But one way or another, there's no point doing these things if they don't have an impact. Now, as a starting point, there will always be a kind of set aims and objectives for what a climate assembly is, but we were also tasked with thinking more broadly in that respect as well. So not just thinking in terms of the pre-stated objectives of a climate assembly, but also what may be some of the unintended or serendipitous impacts of running this sort of process. And Graham mentioned a couple of examples there. First of all, the impact on policy decision making in Ireland, also in the French context of opening up the public debate. So what we weren't trying to do with this framework was to provide a kind of point-by-point guidance of, you have to tick this and check this and score this number 5. And it wasn't supposed to be a tick box exercise so much as opening up thinking about what impact on climate assemblies might be. Okay, next slide, please. Is that right? Well, that, yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, this is intended to be a 2-phase process. So phase 1 is what we're in at the moment, in as much as myself and Christina, building on some other work that I did with a researcher at Bath, have tried to think in a kind of top-down way, a sort of desk-based way, and think about what are the types of impact we might be interested in seeing from climate deliberation, building from other work on climate action, as well as participatory processes. And oh no, one back, please. And as Graham said, the idea of that was to put something on paper. It's always easier to develop and refine something when you've got some ideas that you can amend and thrash out. And so the idea of the framework was to put down some initial ideas, to first of all then get feedback from the wider practitioner base, their perspectives and slants on this. Also importantly, to sort of give our our draft approach to some people, to some guinea pigs. I don't know how well that phrase translates beyond English, but to test out the framework and see how well it worked, what maybe worked, what was maybe a problem. So we are certainly mindful that this is a first attempt. It's a draft. That there's likely to be holes in it, things that can be improved, and so on. But this is our sort of first attempt to develop a framework. And we're very keen to hear from others about what you liked, what you would like to see included or changed or amended. Next slide, please. So at the core of the impact evaluation framework are two dimensions. We sort of went around in circles a lot trying to pin down exactly how you would categorize and conceptualize what impact might look like in the context of climate deliberation and trying to understand impact in that domain. And what we zeroed in on was a two-dimensional approach. You can see this in the impact framework document. And we thought, broadly speaking, there were three areas of impact that you might be interested in when thinking about the impact from climate deliberation. First of all, and perhaps most obviously, or certainly the thing that people tend to be most interested in, look at most, is the policy and political discourse. So if climate deliberation, for example, recommends a particular policy and then policymakers pick that up and bring it into law, that counts as impact. And there are examples of that happening, most famously perhaps the restrictions on short-haul flights in France following the French Climate Assembly. But we were also interested in these broader types of impact, which are perhaps often there in terms of how people talk about the aftermath and the consequences of an assembly, but aren't necessarily pinned down or evaluated as being impact that we might be interested in seeing. First of all, we thought of that in terms of what we've called social and public discourse. Now, that might be in terms of the public debate around climate, public awareness, public participation in that broader discussion and debate, but also in terms of things like media reporting, both the quantity of media reporting and the ways in which climate action is conceptualized by the media and by other forms of public discourse. So we know, for example, to think about another phenomenon that comes around in a kind of cyclical way with relation to climate change. The IPCC reports, whenever they are published, there's usually quite a surge of attention and interest in climate change around the publication of those reports, often then falls away again. And there are people who have, in the research field, looked at how IPCC reporting changes the public discourse, changes how the media engages with climate change. And it seems reasonable to ask, does something similar happen in the context of climate deliberation? And in fact, there is some evidence that you can see a wider impact on the social and public discourse as a result of these processes. We're also interested in whether there was an area of impact in terms of thinking differently about climate change. So this is something that I've developed other work with Claire Mellier in terms of systemic and systems thinking approaches, whether essentially a climate deliberative process, a climate assembly, is able to engender a different type of perspective on climate action. Now, building broadly on the wider literature on public engagement with environmental and technological issues, we thought about types of impact in the following ways. First of all, in instrumental ways, and by instrumental we mean something that changes how things happen. So that might be in terms, for example, of policy and political discourse. It might be in terms of a policy coming into effect. It might be in terms of a policy instrument or type of type of committee or statutory body. We were also interested in types of impact in terms of conceptually thinking about climate change in different ways. And then finally, in terms of capacity building. So do these types of processes enable, can they help to catalyze the participatory approaches more generally in terms of climate action and public engagement? Next slide, please. So this is obviously the text in this is rather too small to get at, but just to give a flavor that this is how we tried to map the two dimensions of these types of impacts and areas of impact. And you can see in a bit more detail in the framework some examples there, but I'll just touch on a few of these now. Next slide, please. So in terms of instrumental impacts, we suggested these might include things like greater ambition in climate policy, changes to the nature of political debate in the UK Parliament, for example. Following the Climate Assembly, there were various elected representatives in the parliamentary chamber who brought up what citizens had said or wanted or recommended within political debates, changes to media coverage and greater public involvement. Conceptual impacts, next slide, please. So yeah, we were thinking that as well as sort of demonstrable specific changes to how things happen or policies that weren't there before but are now as a result of a climate assembly, conceptually speaking, is there evidence from climate assemblies that this brings about things like a greater appreciation of the role of the public in addressing the climate crisis? Does it change how policymakers, businesses, the public think about climate action? And does it change the wider public's understanding or involvement in climate action? It may be that climate assemblies are largely constrained to the very small number of people who have the privilege to participate in them, but are there cases where they are able to engender that wider public involvement? Next slide, please.
Stuart, I'll just interject while I push the button for the next slide that Christina has joined us.
Okay.
So Stuart, feel free to go ahead, but I will let you invite her in if it makes sense for you to do so. Okay,
thank you. I think Christina, I only have one of your slides left, so it would seem a bit rather than you do one slide and me go back. I'll just finish off. That would probably make sense. So in terms of capacity building, yeah, we were thinking about how these processes may give rise to those a broader ability to develop and implement public engagement and deliberative processes. I think an interesting feature of climate assemblies across Europe has been that they are, whilst the sort of grand national assemblies have been kind of often one-off processes, it has led to a wider sense of interest, training, funding, skills development, and so on. For example, in setting up localized or regional climate deliberative processes. So, for example, we've been involved in CAST in a process in Northwest Wales, which is taking some of the learning from those larger processes and applying it in a very rural setting. Next slide, please. Now, I think one thing that I'm very interested in, and coming back to the point about looking at this from the point of view of being a climate researcher, is that when we're thinking about impact, there is, I think, a hierarchy, and at the top of that hierarchy, I have put emissions reduction. Now, that may not be the sort of impact that might be familiar to people working in the sort of participatory democracy field. Why is this the top impact? But from the point of view of climate action, at least in terms of mitigation, then personally, I think that's probably the ultimate thing we would want to see from any such process. Now, of course, it's a lot to ask from a climate assembly. It's been hard to achieve emissions reduction in all sorts of other ways, whether that's representative democracy or technology or anything like that. But really, I feel like this is the pinnacle of what we should be thinking about in terms of climate assemblies. But also there are a range of sort of precursors to that and other positive impacts which can arise and precede that. And these might be things like changes in practices and behavior, changes in legislation, shaping of policy, and so on. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to ask to go to the next slide, if I could, please. And this is something that I did want to finish up on, because I think Graham said at the very start of this session that it was a kind of I think you described it as a nerds workshop, so his words, not mine. But I think it's important when we're talking about considering the impact of climate deliberation to remind ourselves of exactly what we're talking about here, or at least what I think we should be talking about, which is in the year 2023, the extreme urgency of the climate crisis. There's a quote here which has been sort of widely referred to, building on the IPCC's most recent report, which is that any further delay in concerted action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a climate crisis. And as a psychologist and as a behavioral scientist who's been working on climate change for a number of years now, my interest in these processes are precisely because I think it's essential that citizens are deeply involved and invested in that task, and that these types of processes for me offer a kind of a hope that if citizens are really aware of the situation and able to influence action, that can help move things in the right direction. Now, back to the kind of discussion in a kind of nerdish way, what's that got to do with impact evaluation? Well, another quote from the IPCC I've put at the bottom of this slide here is that while climate action is partly about policy, the issue is so deeply embedded, so far-reaching in every aspect of society, that unless, as the IPCC puts this, climate action is able to challenge society's values and achieve deep change, then they'll only be ultimately able to skate over the surface. So that's why I think it's important when we're thinking about impact and in this broad opening up way of thinking about impact, that we're not just talking about sort of tweaking policies, but whether we are able to bring about engagement in a more fundamental level with the problems that we're facing. And I think that's why, for me, climate deliberation is quite different to any other type of participatory approach. And I'll leave it there. I don't know if Christina wants to come in and say hello and offer a comment or two. I'm glad you arrived.
No, I'm sorry that I was late. Thank you very much, Stuart. You did an excellent job.
All right, I'll stop the screen sharing. And first of all, thank you both. Christina, you didn't get much of a chance to say something now, but we know that this was a joint effort for you. So thank you so much for running us through it. I think everyone now has a sense of what the impact evaluation framework is. Now, of course, the really interesting questions underneath this is really how to do really valuable impact evaluation in practice. And the first person that I'd like to invite on stage is someone who's been trying to do this exact thing based on the impact evaluation framework. So, José Luis Fernández Martínez, you have been working with this actually in 2 assemblies, but one of these assemblies was the National Assembly in Spain. And I know that you were asked to try to do an impact evaluation after the assembly. So in a sense, you were asked to do this not at the very beginning where you had a chance to design how to go about the evaluation, but after the fact. But José Luis, would you share with us some of the experiences you had and perhaps some of the advice you'd give on how this this framework could be improved?
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Mark. Well, as Mark said, in the last months, I've been testing the framework in the case of the Spanish Citizen Assembly. So in this presentation, in the last minutes, I'm going to try to focus on some methodological challenge, okay, But to begin, I will highlight the key moments of the Spanish Assembly. So, Mark, can you share the slides for me, please?
Yes. Sorry, José Luis, I wasn't aware that I was doing that. So give me 2 seconds.
I can
do have.
Prefer.
Okay, but you know, if you are able to share them, José Luis, please do, because it frees my hands. Thank you.
So, as I said, to begin, I will highlight the key moments of the Spanish Assembly. Okay. So, in November 2018, the general election took place, and 3 months later, the current government announced the climate emergency. In May 2021, the climate change law was approved, which included the creation of the Assembly. In October, the internal rules of the Assembly were established, and in December, the first session took place. In May 2022, the final session of the Assembly was held, and in June, the proposals were delivered to the President of the government. Okay. During that event, the government committed to responding within 1 year, which would be now in June of 2023. But in the last 2 weeks ago, as maybe you know, an early general elections was announced for July. So this is a very general overview of the key moments of the Spanish Assembly. Okay, so
José Luis, just a quick question. Are you able to share a full screen version of your slides? I believe you do so by pushing a little button at the bottom of the screen that allows it. Yes, that one. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So now I will present the main points of the methodology used to evaluate the impact of the Spanish Assembly. Well, the impact evaluation started in October 2022, and the main objective was to test the impact evaluation framework, focusing on 2 main dimensions: policy and social, and the 3 types of impact: instrumental, conceptual, and capacity building. Okay. To do that, different methodology were employed. So here I will discuss mainly 2: participants survey and social media analysis. However, I'm going to mention a few points before. For example, at first, it was decided not to conduct a survey among the general population to measure the level of awareness and knowledge about the Assembly. Instead, it was conducted a survey among parliamentarians and members of advisory councils on environmental issues. And they were asked about their level of knowledge about different participatory mechanisms on environmental issues, and they were also asked to give their opinion about a selected number of proposals from the Assembly. Okay, so it's important to mention that the response rate among this population is often very low, no? So the information obtained was supplemented with data collected through other methods, such as interviews. to key actors, participants, policy makers, experts who were involved in the process itself. So in this sense, it's important to emphasize that this triangulation is being crucial for overcoming the limitation of its methodology. Okay. Now I will focus on the participants' survey and media and social media analysis. Okay. So as you know, the strongest point of any participant survey is that it allows to identify changes in attitudes, values, and practices related to climate change. However, there are some challenges that an external evaluator has to face. For example, the most obvious aspect is the need to have a baseline data which is obtained before the start of the assembly. A second aspect has to do with the distribution of the survey. Okay, it's very likely that an external evaluation does not have access to the contact list due to data protection issues. Okay, and lastly, of course, the difficulty in determining causal relationships, especially for medium and long-term effects. So if we focus in the Spanish case, a single survey was conducted 9 months after. Okay, so in this case, there was also no baseline data, and access to the participants' contact list was not possible. So some partial solutions had to be adopted. Okay, first, the format of the questionnaire was adapted to try to capture changes in attitudes or behavior. Second, the survey was sent through third parties. I mean, for example, the assembly organizers, among others. And when possible, okay, as we didn't have a baseline data, when possible, the results were compared with data from the general population. Okay. If we the next part, of course, one key element, is the assembly impact on media and social media analysis. Okay, this is because it provides insights into the impact on a broader public. So, but also it's also important to know that this type of data does not require obtaining baseline data before, as it can be obtained afterwards. Okay, and also there is a vast amount of information available, whether generated in traditional media outlets or on social media platforms. Okay. However, there are some difficulties to consider for an external evaluator. For example, external evaluators typically don't have access to the login details of the website and social media account, which may limit their ability to access internal metrics on internet traffic and activity. Furthermore, the vast amount of information needs to be coded which can be a time-consuming task, okay? And above all, because automated content analysis is often not very accurate, it's, in my experience, recommended to code manually the content of the pieces in media, social media analysis. Focus on the Spanish case, we created databases with more than 350 pieces of digital media content. As mentioned before, we did not have the login details. So as a partial solution, we were able to rely on the press clipping provided by the Assembly's communication team. Okay, and we also use various applications to supplement this information. Okay. I have some preliminary results, but I think it's better to stop here, no, and to keep in mind this general overview that I try to focus on the importance of the plurality of methods, okay, and on the triangulation of the different devices. Okay.
Thank you, José Luis. That was very good. So now we've gone from the overall perspective of why the framework was made, and you've made it very concrete for us, some of the challenges faced when you actually need to do this evaluation in practice. So, José Luis, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen, and we'll pass on the microphone to our next speaker. So we're halfway through the interventions now. The next person joining us is Nicole Armos. And I know Nicole is joining us from far away and might have a toddler on her lap for her presentation. But in a way, it's fitting because in a way, the perspective Nicole offers is about why we're doing impact evaluation. So it's very much about the people we're trying to influence. And I'll let you take us through some of your key thoughts, Nicole. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me today and everyone for joining this really interesting discussion. My name is Nicole Armos. I'm the Manager of Knowledge and Practice at Simon Fraser University's Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue based in Vancouver, Canada, where we're working to advance systemic change and democratic participation. And yes, I might have some toddler action in the back. Currently, they're all sleeping. It's early morning here, but do excuse me if there's any interruptions on the way. One of the core focuses in our work has been to deepen our understanding of equity and inclusion and citizen engagement. And in 2020, we published a guide Beyond Inclusion, which introduces 8 principles for equitable public engagement, both within kind of the broader field of public engagement, but it can also be used specifically within citizen assemblies or climate assemblies. And it stipulates that an equity lens should inform the whole project through the initial planning, all the way through the convening phase, and even in the evaluation and follow-up. So when I offered to review Knoca's impact evaluation framework, this was a key angle that I brought to my feedback. And I specifically drew from the work of the Equitable Evaluation Framework, or EEF, which we're linking in the chat. And I want to note here that the framework is open source, but it is a trademarked model, and they have guidelines on their website for attribution and acknowledgement, which are particularly important when we work from an equity perspective and considering that the framework is a work of a Black woman-led enterprise. So if we do incorporate the language of EEF within this work or broadly, I just ask that we offered you credits, and that's how I wanted to start my presentation, because this is definitely a framework that was not developed by us at the center, but that we are drawing from and working to apply to this field. So the framework was developed for the field of philanthropy through the collaboration between the Luminaire Group, the Center for Evaluation Innovation, and the Johnson Center for Philanthropy. Originally published in 2017, they just launched an expanded set of resources, drawing on learnings from several foundations who have been putting the framework into practice. The EEF proposes a paradigm shift in evaluation from the traditional focus on indicators and data collection towards the questions of why, for whom, and to what end. And these are the questions that I'm inviting us to ask when we're designing evaluation for climate assemblies. And I'm going to share here some particular considerations and perspectives that I was able to, kind of apply. So first, in terms of why or to what end, one of the 3 core principles for EEF is that evaluation should hold at its core a responsibility to advance progress towards equity. And as the Knoca team points out, a lot of the evaluation for citizen engagement focuses on the process itself, where one can assess how inclusive and equitable the recruitment or information or process design were. But there's a unique potential to advance equity in our social and ecological systems by evaluating impact. So especially when we're able to offer longitudinal follow-up on real-world policy, social, and systemic change. On the one hand, evaluating impacts can help affirm the value of investing in climate assemblies, and therefore can promote the ongoing use of this inherently equitable model for decision-making. It's therefore important to consider the best knowledge mobilization efforts to help amplify evaluation outcomes among those in the position to commission further deliberation or public engagement. Evaluation of impacts can also have a motivating influence on enactment of change. Our research here at the Center for Dialogue emphasizes that public engagement, for public engagement to be equitable, it must honor the time investment and the effort of participants by engaging them within an authentic and accountable engagement process, where input is meaningfully considered and there's a plan for implementation and follow-up. So by establishing an evaluation system that can trace the real-world impact, we can affirm to participants that their voice was heard and continues to be heard over time. And it helps us collectively hold key parties accountable to implementing recommendations. Especially within the broad framework presented by the IEF, evaluation can also go beyond a summative assessment about whether impact was created or not, because analysis into the pathways and drivers of systemic change can help identify structural barriers, either within the deliberation design or within the governance structures that impede implementation, and explore how to address these in the future. Another principle of equitable evaluation is that the evaluation process should align with the values of equity work, including participant ownership. So just as climate assemblies invite public collaboration in the decision making, and ideally in the design of the assembly itself, we can also invite relevant parties to co-create or inform the evaluation framework early on, including commissioning authorities, practitioners, assembly members, and even the media or businesses or third-party organizations, if you're evaluating kind of the broader social impacts. So in this area, we can draw from the established field of participatory evaluation, which is often used in international development. Participatory evaluation increases the utility of evaluation outcomes, as informants may have greater expertise on the type of information they need to drive change and the evaluative methods that will be most effective in local contexts. For instance, participants or the public might be in the best position to advise us on which types or areas of impact within the IEF are the most meaningful for the community, given local priorities and histories. They might suggest effective methods to collect data on social and systemic impacts because they have deeper expertise on community networks. Or they might offer a unique perspective on what their community needs in terms of, for instance, capacity building impacts. So participatory evaluation can also increase transparency in evaluation and a sense of ownership in the climate assembly and its impacts, empowering and motivating participants and decision makers to push for change on multiple levels. Evaluating, so finally, the third principle of EEF is that evaluation should ask critical questions about the historical, cultural, and structural factors contributing to the condition being addressed and how the intervention impacts the systemic drivers of inequity. So for climate assemblies, we might ask, how do historical, cultural, and structural factors contribute to the causes of climate change, existing climate action or inaction, in the community, and the consequences for climate change for different communities. And we evaluate in order to understand if and how climate assemblies help advance justice and equity in these areas. So for example, does the framing of the assembly topic and the information presented within the assembly support deliberation and conceptual changes on issues of climate justice? do the ensuing recommendations, policy changes, and climate actions advance change in a way that accounts for local and global inequities, such as the disproportionate impact of climate change on particular communities? And do capacity building efforts explicitly build skills and understanding for equitable forms of deliberation, media communications, and mobilizing action? And I think this is the key for me, is that whether it's equity within citizen engagement in general or within evaluation, I think it's really important to constantly be thinking about it explicitly. We often think, you know, we're doing good work. We know it's for good purposes, for justice and equity. But when we stop and we actually frame a question that explicitly centers equity, it often helps us think about different perspectives, different avenues for the way we frame our work and design our work that puts equity at the center. So there's a lot more to explore within the equity evaluation framework, including mindset shifts about things like objectivity, rigor, and validity that can help kind of push us in the right direction. But I'm going to leave off here today, and I invite you to explore it further.
That was wonderful, Nicole. Thank you. I'll just say, so from a process point of view, that you will all have a chance to engage with both José Luis, Nicole, and everyone else who's been speaking today when we go to the breakout room. So we have 2 more inputs, but I just want to say, Nicole, now we thought we were getting a hang of what evaluation might look like and how we might assess impact. But what you're basically saying is there's a whole systemic level of cultural and historical things we need to take into account too. So if we thought it wasn't complex already, we now know definitely it is. And we're going to actually try now to add even more complexity. So bear with us. Ramon van der Doos will take the word in a second. He's a PhD researcher from UC Louvain outside of Brussels. And Ramon, you have a very specific challenge of trying to say 2 very complex things in a very short amount of time. I'll leave the floor to you and let's see how it goes.
Thanks, Mark. I'm gonna try to share my screen. I think this should work. Is that correct?
Perfect.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, because I didn't see you. There we go. Yeah, so thanks for having me. So I suppose I'm one of the liberation nerds who's been asked to share some thoughts on how we might still improve the evaluation framework. And I'll be sharing my thoughts on 3 things in the framework that I think are very important to talk about. First one is how we think about systems and systemic change. Second, intended and unintended impacts. And third, impact pathways. So let's start with systems and systemic change. So there's a broad call for system change nowadays. So change the system, not the climate, as the slogan goes. And in the evaluation framework, we also find references to systems thinking and systemic impact. But what does system actually refer to? What do we mean when we talk about systemic change? Well, I feel that we all intuitively get that it's about something fundamental. But you know, we cannot simply point to one specific set of actors or certain institution and say, you know, there you go, that's the system. System is really more than the sum of its parts. Now, I like to go by Donna Meadows' conceptualization of systems. As she puts it, it's an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. So it consists of certain elements which are interconnected in some way to achieve a particular purpose. Those are really the 3 building blocks that together then make up the system. So let me explain that by means of an example. Let's look at a football team as a system. So the key elements are the players and the coach, and the interconnections are, for example, the rules of the game and the coach's strategy, determining how the elements, or here the players, then interact. And the purpose is to win games and ultimately, let's say, the league. Now, let's translate that to climate governance. If we're talking elements in human systems, we're in the first place talking actors. And when we think about governance, those are not only state actors, but also non-state actors like NGOs, companies, etc. Interconnections determining how those actors behave include a variety of what we could refer to as structures or institutions. Now, those can include formal laws, but also social norms, thinking, you know, how actors think they should behave, and for example, paradigms, so how actors assume the world works. Now, finally, we can think of the purpose of that system of climate governance as attaining certain system level outcomes, like reducing greenhouse gas emissions or, avert further climate breakdown. So that all leads to a different picture of how we can think of areas of impact compared to the current evaluation framework. And what is important, I think at least, that in this understanding, changes in structures are not the same as systemic change. The system shows itself really in this interplay between the actors and those structures, producing then certain system level outcomes like reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's my view on systems, at least. Sorry? Okay.
Oh, let's see if we can mute that microphone. Ramon, go ahead.
Thanks. So now in theory, climate assemblies might influence any of those actors or structures of the system, and thereby in the end, potentially influence the functioning of the system as a whole. But what kind of impacts should we focus on in the evaluations? That's the big question, right? So the first thing we often focus on are intended impacts. So impacts in terms of what the organizers wanted or expected the assembly to achieve. But climate assemblies may also have unintended impacts. So impacts that occur, but which were not the objectives set by the commissioning body or were not expected at all. And the evaluation framework hints at that too by suggesting that we might need to go beyond evaluating those intended impacts. But why should we? Well, it could be that an assembly has negative side effects that might otherwise go unnoticed. Or, for example, like Graham said in the beginning, the evaluation might otherwise not really reflect the significance or the reach of an assembly's impact. Now, whether it therefore pays off to also look into unintended impacts, we can discuss later in the breakout rooms. But whichever kind of impact we focus on, another big question is then, how can we assess whether the assembly was truly responsible for it? And what is important here, I think, is that when we're doing evaluations, that we think about plausible pathways connecting the assembly to a specific impact. Now, it's always extremely difficult to establish some sort of causal link, right, because there are so many factors at play. But what I want to emphasize is that we can come up with more or less plausible stories about why we think an assembly led to a given impact. And what's key here is that we think about what the pathway connecting the assembly and the impact is like. Now, that is about, what I think that is about is that we specify concrete actions in between that we think we'd need to observe empirically for us to be able to say, okay, now it seems very plausible that the two are linked. So that we specify action 1, 2, etc. And we can do so based on prior literature on the impacts of assemblies, giving us some hints or flavors of what might go on in between and why the two might be linked, as well as based on our knowledge of the particular context. So I want to invite you to not only think about what are the potential impacts of an assembly and then jump immediately towards, okay, what are the indicators for these impacts, but to also first think hard about how the assembly and those impacts that you're interested in might actually be linked. So I intentionally tried to keep it short. So I hope that I've provided some extra food for thought. And if ever you'd like to talk about it more after the workshop, you can reach me here. Thanks.
Wonderful, Ramon. Well done for saying some very complex things very clearly. So just another meta perspective is that we are recording this, so you can go back and watch the different presentations. We have one left now. And let me see if I can pronounce your name. Julian, I can't pronounce your name, actually. You're going to have to help me with that. But you're a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Stuttgart. And you have another challenge now, which is to talk a little bit about legitimacy, because legitimacy is a core topic for all climate assemblies. But I know you have some particularly interesting perspectives to share on that. So, Julian, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me. I will just disconnect my earplugs. So yes, so my name is Julien. It's a very French name. It's difficult for the other people to pronounce it. So I'm very happy to be here. So I've been asked to discuss 4 points during my presentation, and I know that it's already the time for the break, so I will try to keep it very concise. So the first point I want to discuss today is basically the purpose of the climate assemblies. So I've studied citizens' assemblies in general, so not only the one about climate. And for us, scholars working on citizens' assemblies, we see they function as one that creates legitimacy for public decisions. So it's not about achieving the most ambitious political outcome, but to generate public decisions that receive the legitimacy of a large part of the public. And so when I saw in the IF that the objective of citizens' assemblies on climate were to reduce the CO2 emission, for me it was different from what I'm used to, because in the literature, again, the idea is that the citizens' assemblies are meant to produce more legitimate public decisions. And so basically, here, the climate assemblies follow a political objective of reducing CO2 emission, but for us, it's more about a democratic objective, which is, again, the legitimacy. And the issue is that basically the legitimacy stems from the public opinion, like a large majority in the population supports the public decision, and that's like the core of the legitimacy. The issue is that citizens' assemblies cannot replace the public opinion, because basically the participants of climate assemblies are not the same as the broad population. And why is that? It's because basically when ordinary citizens participate in a climate assembly, they become some sort of expert citizens because they receive information on climate change, they receive basically they learn a lot about the issue, they deliberate with a lot of different citizens from different backgrounds, and so they become very aware of the issue. But the rest of the population has not gone through that epistemic transformation, and they remain the same basically. And so what do we do with the outcome of the climate assembly? What's the added value? Well, it helps to show what the public would think had they the chance to learn about the issue and deliberate on it. And so basically that gives a signal to politicians, to decision makers to say, okay, so the climate assembly wants to have this ambitious policy, but what does the general public think about it? And the idea is that the politicians rely on the recommendations of the climate assembly to engage with the public to say, okay, you may not agree with the policy, but look, citizens like you have changed their preferences due to deliberation. So let's have this debate together. And then we see where the public opinion lands when we adopt the climate plan. So again, if you have like a recommendation from a climate assembly that supports a very ambitious climate plan, it's not the green light to just go ahead. You also have to think what's the position of the general public, because that public is the one that's important for the legitimacy of public decision. So that was the first point I wanted to discuss. The second one was about evaluating climate assemblies based on the original aims. And why is that important? Because it's quite easy for the commissioners of climate assemblies to fall back on other aims if the original objectives are not met. So for instance, if we have a climate assemblies which wants to generate a national climate plan, but that's not the case in the end. They do not succeed in producing that climate plan, then they can always find out, they can always rely on other contributions. Like for instance, we have involved the public in policy making, we have used their input for different reflections, we have opened the doors of the parliament, of the government to the citizens. They can always find like positive contributions, but we have to hold the commissioning bodies, the politicians accountable for the original aims. Have they met them or not? That's what's important when we evaluate climate assemblies. And then the two last points, I will briefly discuss them. The first one is basically the IEF describes, gives an overview of all the different outcomes that citizens' assemblies can generate. But the thing is, it's always quite difficult to study all of them in details. And so the point is, instead of wanting to be exhaustive and study all the possible impacts like superficially, maybe it could be interesting to just focus on one. because then you have more time and energy to control for all the external factors that may also account for the change, for the impact. And then maybe it also gives you a chance to delve deeper into the specific influence that citizens' assemblies can have. Because sometimes, for instance, if you look at all the recommendations and then you look at the congruency in public decisions, it takes already a lot of time. But that maybe one single recommendation actually had a huge impact. But to know that, you need to interview policymakers, public servants, and so on, and that takes time. So it's basically a question of less is more. Maybe if you study one type of impact in detail, you can basically generate more plausible, more evidence-based findings. And the final point was about short-term impact versus long-term impact. So basically, it's easier to study short-term impact because you have less external factors that can account for the impact on, for instance, policy making. But if you broaden the scope and you study the impact on the long term, it becomes much more difficult because a lot of the other factors can also explain the impact. And also when you study these changes on the long term, you need to adopt a systemic approach. And basically that requires not considering the citizens' assembly as the center of the system, because policy changes take decades, and it's really like a question, when you have these policy changes on the long term, it's the result of basically an alignment of the stars. You know, you need a lot of luck. You need to have an alignment of the stars. And if you just study this kind of impact from the perspective of the climate assemblies, well, it's, how can I say this? Basically, you miss a lot that what's happening in the system. So basically, this kind of long-term changes takes time to study. You need to control for a lot of external factors, and you need also to study it from the systemic angle and not from the implementation of the climate assemblies. So I try to keep it short. I will be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Julien. And it was your last name that I didn't dare to pronounce. So I'm still curious. Maybe we'll hear you say that soon, because we'll be jumping into breakout rooms right after a break. But we all do need a break now. So let me just sum up by saying that we've gone through quite a lot of aspects now around what it means to do impact evaluation. And it's very clear that it's very complex. And what several people are hinting at is that to measure cause and effect, you really need to do a lot of hard work. And you need to not only think about how conceptually you're going to do it, but you need to also integrate it into the process of how you manage your assembly. So this is something to be explored with you, the people in our network who have been working either directly as practitioners or maybe as researchers as well. So when we get back from the break, we'll jump into breakout rooms and we'll ask all of you to contribute with everything you can. So we're back. Good to see everyone back again. I'm sure many of you were right in the middle of an interesting discussion, but what we will do now is we'll try to just have a bit of a shared reflection on what we've been through together now. So the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to invite someone from each of the rooms to just reflect back to all of us. What were the most interesting highlights of your discussions? And in no particular order, how about the group with Graham and Nicole?
That's Robert.
Yes, thanks. Sorry, I had some trouble unmuting there. Okay, well, it was a fascinating discussion. One theme was who should be included in the participatory design process of the evaluation. And so there was talk about including both participants from the wider community, marginalized groups, representatives of different stakeholder groups, using targeted selection in the pre-planning process for the assembly, as well as at some point during the assembly, getting input from the randomly selected participants. and their advantages and disadvantages of where I guess that we talk mostly about the advantages of having input from both groups. But one of the challenges is that there are costs to engaging in that pre-planning process in terms of planning and time and gathering resources, and the challenges of fundraising for that extended evaluation process. Let me see here other items that were mentioned. So Erwin talked about having a kind of climate assembly to design the evaluation process and to design the climate assembly itself. I mean, that would involve using sortition to select the participants in the participatory design process. Nicole said that that her designing equity guide had been designed using a participatory design process that involved targeted selection from members of the community. Elisa talked about establishing some interaction between the wider community members involved in designing the evaluation before the assembly and the assembly participants, that there could be benefits to that kind of interaction. See, Nicole said, let me see, okay. See, and then there was, Deborah said, let me see, I've got some comments from Deborah here. Deborah talked about incorporating measures about consequences for the most vulnerable and those who are responsible for causing climate change, those who are contributing to the problem and holding them accountable. And Agnieszka talked about participants and respondents should be informed. Oh, and informing the participants of the evaluation results and enabling discussion and deliberation about the results of the evaluation. So making that stage of the evaluation process participatory as well. Did I miss anything, colleagues?
I see thumbs up from Graham.
Great.
And it felt very comprehensive and clear, Robert. Thank you very much for that. You had a rich discussion, clearly. Let's see if that was the case in some of the other rooms. Now, again, without any particular order, I'm looking at Morten on my screen. So Morten and Julian, who from your room would like to tell us what you were talking about?
I'm gonna share some insights from our group. Yes, so we also had a very fascinating discussion about the public legitimacy and pitfalls, especially oriented about the role of the media as well. So we have on one side the point made that the broader population and the assembly are not equal, especially on two factors. So after participating in the process, the group are not equal to the assembly, obviously on their knowledge, but also on the deliberative experience that they've been through. And typically the media covers only the recommendations and not the process. So what the broader public is gaining insights are not about the process, but the recommendations. And the legitimacy potential is depending on the process leading up to the recommendations and not the recommendations in themselves. But then again, on the other side, you have a defense of this legitimacy potential of assemblies, going against what Lafond has formulated as there is no shortcuts. You have to have the broad fight of the broader public as well. So the defender goes that this group of people, they are an actual proxy of the broader population. And if you are able to have a public debate, if the media actually are able to tell what has happened, and not only in headlines, but what is the reflections and what are the arguments leading to the recommendations, then you can have this masked public deliberation figured together, and not having the assembly isolated from it. So let me see what I missed from that. Yeah, so from that debate around the media, this is very important to have to be able to compare the views of the mini public and the broader public from their public opinions. And some points about that climate action is different than other policy issues. It's not either A or B. And then we have seen this new wave of deliberative mini publics where they are initiated from civil society, and they have not been able to challenge the legitimacy as well. So the question would be, how do we do that? And is there a risk of actually succeeding with having a public debate around the legitimacy and the process if that is counterproductive? I'm sorry if I didn't manage to get that one. Yeah. Yes, I think that's what I'm gonna end with.
Very good, Morten. Any additions from group members, or are we covered? I think that means we're covered. Thank you, Morten. So let's see, who do we have left? I know that my group hasn't spoken. I think, Ramon, I kind of coerced you into saying something on behalf of our group. So can you share a bit about what we were talking about?
Okay, it'll be short, so I hope someone will help me. We talked about many things, and I think we were all a bit baffled with this whole idea of systemic change and causal pathways, and it was more a discussion about how difficult it is to specify these pathways, but there was also some optimism that, you know, at least something is possible, and we should do something with these pathways if we want to say something about the links, or I don't want to say causality, I know it's a bit sensitive, but between the assembly and the impacts. So I think that was quite optimistic still. And we get some examples too from people who are doing it on the ground, looking at different actors in this broader system, and not just looking at the state or policy. You want to jump in, Christina, to add some extras?
Yeah. Hang on, I'm already making notes for my final reflection. I think let's leave it for my final reflection, and I'll mention some points.
I think you did a good job, Ramon. Anyone else from the group want to add a final thought? And as I don't see anyone jumping in, let's jump to the last group. So Stine, José Luis, and everyone else in your group, who would like to share your conversation?
Yes, thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Well, I was just going to skip the word for Charlotte, but you've taken the floor, and that's so good. Please go on, Charlotte.
Thank you. Okay, so we had also many different kind of themes while discussing our experiences with applying the framework. And we talked about the importance of the public and political discourse, and whether it belongs to the policy level or not, and which role the political discourse plays. We also talked about the data collection process, and highlighted the importance of conducting interviews to kind of complement the paper and policy work. And also we raised the question here on how to conduct the interviews to really measure the impact, and whether we need some guidelines on how to do well in the interviews to really get some insights about the political discourse and the political attitudes and opinions of policymakers. And then we also briefly touch upon how we select policy recommendations. So whether that we apply the framework by sector, or whether we choose successful recommendations from assemblies, and or look at successful versus unsuccessful policy recommendations, and how to deal with this issue. And then in the end, and I think that was really a great insight, we said that the framework is very helpful, but that it kind of also needs, or that by applying the framework, we need some more help with the operationalization of the framework. So kind of what methods are out there to operationalize the framework, and what are the strengths and solutions of those methods. So for example, is there like other methods than process tracing, for example, and that maybe also invites for some further discussions with the group. And yeah, maybe some of my colleagues want to add something if I missed the point, and if not, then I hand the word back to Mark.
And I'll leave a second of silence to see. And no one jumped in, Charlotte. I think you did a very good job. So we have about 15 minutes left. Graham will be the last person to take the floor to send us off. Before that, I'd love to hear from Stuart and Christina on how they have heard and received everything. But I want to just make sure that if anyone in the room now has a burning reflection, something that they feel on behalf of everyone would be interesting, I would like to offer a few minutes to just see if there are any hands from anyone else in the room.
She says. It's been a long afternoon, Mark.
Yeah, perhaps that is the conclusion, that no one has anything particular to add now.
Maybe Mark, if I can, I have, I don't know whether these are reflections or more confusions in my mind, but maybe I try to spell them out and you tell me whether I'm totally confused. I was thinking, so I was in room 1 talking about equality, and how this might fit in an evaluation framework, evaluation of impact framework, especially in a participatory evaluation framework. And now I have 2 questions in my mind. The first is, and you were the one presenting the recruitment process question, during the spring school, and you were pointing to the fact that now, especially media, but let's say those that are more critics about citizen assembly, they are pointing to the fact that the recruitment, if it's not done very well, then it's not very representative in terms, the assembly cannot really be representative. This becoming a hook of criticism, right? And I was wondering whether there is not a risk of precisely creating a confusion between evaluating the impact as a way to also tackle the question of equality in the process, with the question of whether there was equality among participants in terms of participation, in terms of representativeness of different backgrounds, life condition, and so on. So this is a reflection more about whether equality is not one of those terms that might suggest more confusion than anything else. So if it is to be brought into an evaluation of impact process, I think it's good to anticipate some risk of misuse by, let's say, critics and so on. And the second one, we discussed also about how important it is to start the evaluation process, let's say, as early as possible, as opposed to at the end of the process, just when the process has ended, then ask, oh, can you do an impact evaluation of the process? Then you don't have any baseline and so on. But I was wondering what should be in place. So first of all, this is very difficult, we already know. But let's say that we can do this. I was wondering whether this might create some kind of unfortunate interaction between designing the evaluation process and the designing of the assembly itself, so that the 2 processes that in theory should not interfere with each other, actually they create a kind of loop. So we know that those that evaluate should not be the one that designs, but if there is a kind of temporal synchronicity between the two processes, maybe we should be very careful about putting in place measures to avoid that then there is a mirroring between these phases. That's it. Thanks.
I think those were some great questions, Elisa. I don't presume to want to be the one to answer them, in fact, but I think you got us reflecting, which is a big point for all of this. I mean, there's always a question of how to make sure that you that someone doesn't hijack the agendas of any given assembly. So I think a lot of what you're saying is really for us to reflect on in terms of design. And I think Deborah's comment about making sure that you actually incorporate the evaluation formally into the design of the assembly is really important. I was going to hand over the word to Stuart and Christina now, but Erwin, you just managed to get your hand up in time. Yeah. So you get the final word before we have some closing reflections.
Yeah, the only thing I'm missing in this evaluation discussion is the consequence on democracy itself, because climate assemblies are still citizens' assemblies and they're still in an experimental phase. Nobody knows really how to do and to behave with it, especially the politicians. So to evaluate the discussion on democracy itself and the place of sortition processes in democracy, this should also be evaluated, although it is a climate assembly evaluation. That's the point. We should not forget it.
Thank you, Erwin. Another very good reflection. So we're getting close to the end, and Christina and Stuart, you started this in the sense that you both introduced the framework at the beginning of the workshop. Of course, you also started it by writing the framework in the first place. I feel it's appropriate that you should also get a chance to reflect on what we've heard here today. So in no particular order, Christina and Stuart, would you share how you have received this input today?
Of course. Stuart, do you want to go first, or would you like me to go first?
Oh, you go first, because
right.
I hogged things at the start.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I think for me, there's always been, I mean, it's been super helpful having this conversation. I always really enjoy these conversations because they put us in touch with a whole range of disciplines, ways of thinking, different contexts. And I think sometimes, particularly as academics, we can be very kind of focused on one particular thing. And in the world of climate assemblies, that's really not very helpful. So I think it's been really, really exciting. I think it also speaks to the tension that an impact evaluation framework holds. And I think what we've struggled with is that for us, we started with a kind of it's a conceptual framework, trying to think about what possible impacts, not even short-term outcomes, but possible impacts a climate assembly could have. And with sort of the aim of broadening out people's thinking on the impacts that are possible, and also that they should be evaluated. So it's not just about evaluating whether there was deliberation. Did people learn something? Did they change their minds, or the design process? So that was really the goal, I think, initially. And there's lots of stuff there still where we need to kind of think about that conceptual side of things. And I really enjoyed the conversations around systems thinking, climate justice, and this idea that climate assemblies are experiments in democracy. And again, there's so many different fields that are relevant here, and they all have, to some extent, probably overlapping theories of change, like how does change happen and what role could climate assemblies play in that. There's also theories around how individuals can affect system change or not. And we think about that a lot in our center, where we think about the individual or people or households and how they impact, can take part in social transformations around climate change. So there's a lot going on there for us to think about, and it's been very helpful in that sense. Also, the questions around legitimacy and the political process, which I'm not an expert in, have been helpful thinking through that. And it makes me think a little bit about, climate assemblies. They could play a particular role in legitimacy, and this idea that people, politicians can get sort of a social, like a mandate for action based on this kind of group of people who are now informed and have made recommendations. But climate change is a specifically complex issue. So you have to also continue engaging and look at, so if you have a national level process, you might make recommendations and they might have some legitimacy, but then how does that play out? What is the consequence of those recommendations in a particular community, in a particular place? You know, there's a continuous process that needs to occur for that legitimacy to continue and for things to be fair and to have kind of fairness and justice sort of as a core principle. So that was one of my reflections. And then the second bit, and I'll be very quick. So that's the kind of conceptual thing, which I think sometimes my brain does go a bit, it's going to explode, like Graham says, but we'll manage. The second bit is the practical bit, which I actually feel like we could explore in a lot more detail, and I'd feel quite comfortable probably doing, and we could, you know, involve loads of people in trying to figure out what are good indicators, how do you do process tracing, what are the different methods, how do you data triangulate? I mean, I think we didn't see that as our goal at this particular moment in time, so we as a group need to kind of decide how much guidance do we want to give. So do we want to make sure that people who might do climate assemblies in the future think more broadly about the goals versus how you actively practically, I think both are equally important, but they're linked, but different questions on how do you actually evidence possible change that you have theorized might happen. So those are my final reflections, and thank you very much everyone for your input.
Thank you, Christina. Over to you, Stuart, if you have a final reflection or two. Thank you.
Yeah, and yes, thanks as well to everyone. As usual, I feel in awe of everybody's experience and insights. And there's a lot for us to think about. I think there are clearly some very difficult questions here about, you know, how we define what impact is, what to exclude or include, how to track and measure, operationalize, and so on. And those are all really important questions. My final reflection really is that, but though that underneath the surface of all this, I think is what impact are we talking about? What is a climate, emphasis on the word climate, what is a climate assembly for? What outcomes, impacts would you expect or hope for from a climate assembly? And it might be a fairly modest ambition, helping people offer advice on the government's own terms, on the policy specifics, which is a bit like the UK's climate assembly, in which case impact might be preferring one policy over another, giving kind of approval to that. It might be a little broader, opening up, you might want to open up the ideas in the room to the assembly members on climate action, in which case impact might be in terms of some imaginative innovations in policy or changing how the public can be part of the conversation on climate action. But it might go beyond that. It might be about opening up public engagement and involvement in climate action beyond just, you know, the 100 or so people in the room itself. And that's, I guess that's what I'm personally most interested in, although that's the biggest, you know, the hardest and most ambitious thing. And I think the final, most sort of elevated ambition, and maybe this sort of relates a bit to Erwin's point, is in the context of climate action, could these processes have consequences, ideally positive ones, for democracy itself? Do they have the potential to change the ways in which citizens, society looks at, you know, this issue in the face of this massive upheaval we're facing? And I've got thunder rolling above my head. But you know, this is a huge urgent issue. Can it help us to really face up to the climate crisis? And I would hope that would be something they could help with.
Wonderful, Stuart. In a moment, Graham, you can take us through the final thing. I feel like it's my obligation to thank everyone first. It's been incredibly rich, and it has been rich because of the contributions of all of you. So that goes literally for everyone in the call, but I want to emphasize, of course, the people who have been on stage today. So Christina and Stuart, thank you for providing the framework in the first place and allowing everything to follow. Thank you to the reviewers who did a great job, and also to the ones who weren't on stage today. There's actually a few people who were here. You saw Charlotte Cast just now, who's been using the framework. Claire Millier has been working on evaluation with the framework. Patrick Scherhofer, who's here too, has been reviewing the framework. So there's a lot of people. But Nicole, Julien, Ramon, and José Luis, thank you so much for contributing. So with all those thanks out of the way, Graham, what's left to say?
Well, thank you, Mark, for pulling it all together. Maybe that's what I've got to say. So just a couple of things in response to what Christina and Stuart were saying. I think Christina's right about not expecting too much from the framework. I mean, there's already a lot in there, but I think we've got to distinguish between creating a framework that opens up people's imagination about what they can do in relation to think and how they can think about impact. But what we may well need to do is provide some supplementary materials, some appendices or something that actually helps people think through the different methods they can use and the challenges associated with those methods. And I think separating those two things out might be really helpful. The most interesting conversation I think I'm going to have after this is talking to Christina and Stuart about whether they want to do the next iteration. I hope that they do, because I think it's a really exciting project. And it's been really great having you all engage in this way, because this is exactly what we want. This is the knowledge network part of the network, actually pulling people into the same room and trying to have these discussions together. Well, there will be in autumn, winter time, a second iteration of this. That will again be a draft, which is open for discussion. So do not think you've got away from it just by spending 2.5 hours with us. You will also be receiving the next draft version, and we'll hopefully be developing this further together. And we'll talk about what it is that we as a community need in order to do good impact evaluation, because as Stuart was saying, we are running these things for a reason. We are running these things for many people. This is for most people running a climate assembly, it's because they recognize there is a real problem in relation to climate governance. For a number of people on this call, it's because they believe that response to climate governance needs to be a democratization of governance. So there's a really interesting series of things that all of us are really committed to. Just a last, I mean, you've had enough of the Knowledge Network, I'm sure, for this year, but just a last advertisement on Wednesday afternoon. We have our annual event. It's going to involve a bunch of things, including hopefully we'll confirm this, a keynote from the convener of the Biodiversity Loss Assembly in Ireland. We're having an innovations party. I can't think of a better word for it, where people who have tried it, different innovations in assemblies, are going to share their work with us. And we'll also be looking at the trends report that we've recently produced. So an afternoon of fun with the Knowledge Network before the summer starts. Anyway, look, it's been an absolutely delightful afternoon. Once again, thank you again to Christina and Stuart for really kicking us off with this. Thank you for Mark for pulling this all together. And thank you for all the contributors, whether we'd formally invited you to contribute or you took part in the discussions. It's been a really great afternoon. Thank you, everybody. Take care.